I just want to thank again, like I do every week, I try to do every week, our worship team for leading us in worship this morning, as I just killed the spirit of reverence there. But I like this. I love the last song that they did, and I really feel like there's somebody here that needed to sing that and know that. The last words there, I may be weak, but your spirit's strong in me, and my flesh may fail, and I don't want to ever assume that we've all got our lives together, because we don't. I mean, there's brokenness, and we're really good at hiding it so many times. But anyway, I really hope that worship time, we sing to the glory of God, and we sing about God, but I feel like the words to the songs that we sing can minister to us too. And so I just hope and pray that was true for you this morning. Happy holiday to you. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the first day of bow season. So I noticed we're missing a few men this morning, and so, no, I'm just kidding. I was laughing at Justin Malden, who I think he went out in the woods early this morning and then taught Sunday school. And I was like, dude, if you come fully camoed out and have a deer in the back of your truck, I think that would be the greatest lesson for my kids, to go out there and watch you clean a deer. So he didn't do that. I guess you got to kill one first. But anyway, I love you, Justin. You know that. He's embarrassed. But I want to start, we're going through the book of Daniel, and we're in Daniel chapter 6 this morning. And Jesus had a really good way. He had a knack for saying some really uncomfortable things to the people that were following him. And a lot of times he said these things when there were a ton of people following him. We know, based on some of the scriptures in the Bible, that there were at times up to 20,000 people following Jesus at any given time. When he fed the 5,000, that was just 5,000 men. They didn't count women and children back in the day, and many Bible scholars believe that if you were to include women and children in that, then that was upwards of 20,000 people that were following Jesus that day. And so Jesus, when he would have these big crowds, he knew that in those crowds there were three groups of people. The first group of people wanted to kill him. Okay, those were the Pharisees. And that's never a good group of people to have. I hope there are not a group of people here at Good Hope that want to kill me. If you do, please just let me know, and we'll try to work something out on the side. The second group of people that were always following Jesus were those that were kind of the fence sitters. They were the ones that were the casual followers. They were usually just following Jesus because he was doing something cool. And he had a lot of cool things to offer, like he would give out food one day, and he would heal people, and all of these different things. And then the third group of people that were usually following Jesus were his disciples. And those were the people, and that's not just the 12. The Bible says that Jesus had many disciples, but the 12 are the ones that he kind of took to the side and did ministry with. And those are the ones that he was really calling. And so Jesus would oftentimes say things that would separate those groups of people. And he would say, I've come to call followers, not just casual followers. We've called it here in this church before the casual Christian, the Sunday Christian. We live in the Bible Belt where everybody's a Christian, right? If I were to poll everybody in this room, it'd be like, I'm a Christian. If you were to poll most people in this town, I'm a Christian. If you were to poll people in the South, I'm a Christian. But Jesus is not really out for the American version of Christianity. He's out for true followers of himself that will give their entire lives to be transformed and be obedient by him. And so Jesus would often say things to really draw a line in the sand. And one of the examples that he gives, that we have in the Bible of him doing this, is in Luke chapter 14, verse 27. Jesus has thousands of people following him, and he draws the line in the sand. He says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And so he pretty much separates the casual followers, the people that were just along for the ride because Jesus was doing a few cool things, and the disciples. He lays the line down. You can't be my follower if you don't bear your cross, come after me, and follow me. Well, Oswald Sanders wrote a book called Spiritual Discipleship, and he says in that book about this. He says, taking up your cross means sacrifice and suffering. It involves costly renunciations. It is symbolic of rejection by the world. It involves a willingness to accept ostracism and unpopularity with the world for Christ's sake. I highlighted and bolded and did crazy things to the negative words in that, and there's 6 of them. You see, bearing your cross is not something popular. It's not something that people normally sign up for, because in Jesus' day, see, he hadn't died on the cross, so they weren't thinking Easter and all these things. They were thinking Roman execution, and so this shocked his hearers when he said, if you want to be my follower, you have to bear your cross and come after me. Because we don't normally do this when we see passion plays and Easter musicals and all that, because we live in a censored society, I guess, and it's probably not a good thing to do in your local church. But Jesus was naked when he died. They would crucified you naked if you were a Roman victim. Why? Because it wasn't just painful torture, it was shame. They wanted to humiliate you to your very last breath. And so when Jesus' disciples heard this, they hear humiliation, rejection, criminal, all of these things, torture. And Jesus draws a pretty strong line in the sand. In fact, when his disciples were together with him the night before his arrest, or the night of his arrest, he prepared them. And in John chapter 15, Jesus really prepared them for what was to come. And in verse 18, Jesus said this, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. What Jesus is basically saying is, if you take up your cross and you follow me and you're a disciple of me, the world will hate you. And it's so much easier as a Christian, especially in the South, okay? And I love Raylan because I'm a product of the South. I'm a preacher's kid from the South, so I've been around it. I was one. It's so much easier to fit in with the world, because then the world's going to love you. And it's so easy because everybody goes to church on Sunday, or at least, several Sundays out of the year. And everybody knows John 3:16, and everybody knows Jesus and God and all that stuff. But Jesus said, if you choose to follow me, that's something completely different. If you choose to follow me, the world's going to hate you because you don't look like them anymore. And I've really found myself as a believer, since I began to take my walk with the Lord seriously as a late teenager. I found myself, and I think if you were honest with yourself, then you've been there too, that it's tempting to sometimes sit back and say, I don't know if this is worth it. Have you ever been in that place where you are trying to follow Jesus and you're trying to be obedient and you're trying to pursue holiness and you're trying to walk with the Lord, and yet everything from the world, your friends, your family that aren't believers is coming at you, and sometimes you just sit back and go, is it worth it? Is it worth going through this? Because listen, there's a lot of pressure in this fallen world to be a follower of Jesus, to take up your cross and follow him. And that's exactly where we find Daniel today. You see, because if your life's like mine, you've got people in your life, if you're following Jesus, you might have people in your life who are waiting for you to screw up. They're waiting for you to make a moral failure. They're waiting for you to say something, lose your temper. They're waiting for you to cheat on your spouse, do anything like that, so that they can point at you and go, knew it wasn't real. What is it? I mean, our favorite word is hypocrite. And they're waiting. I mean, there are tons of people that I know that would love to see me fail. Because then they could say, I knew he was a joke. I knew he was a hypocrite. I knew it. And I know you've probably got people like that in your life as well. But ultimately, those people are not your accusers. Those people are not your enemy. Paul says in the New Testament that our enemy, we don't wrestle, our battle is not with flesh and blood, but with the principalities of darkness. Satan is the accuser. That's in fact, in the Bible, that's what his name literally means. Satan means accuser. And so, how do we stand firm in a fallen world? This is exactly, again, where we see Daniel in Daniel chapter 6. The truth that we're going to unpack today is this. When the world stands firmly against you, you can stand firmly on the faithfulness of your deliverer. When the world stands firmly against you, you can stand firmly on the faithfulness of your deliverer. Let's read Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Look, we're just going to walk through this together. Now remember, if you were here last week, Babylon has been overthrown by the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Belshazzar is dead.
So there's a new king, new kingdom. Daniel's about 86 years old now, and he has been elevated to a high place of leadership in this new kingdom. And look at verse 1. It says, "It pleased Darius the king to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. And over these 120 guys would be 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set Daniel over the whole kingdom." Like he's planning to promote Daniel to vice president, basically. Then, verse 4, "The presidents and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel in regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint or any fault against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God.'" Daniel was a hated man. Daniel was a hated man, and he had a bunch of enemies. But the crazy thing is, he hadn't done anything to create these enemies. He hadn't gone out and swindled a bunch of people. He hadn't gone out and gossiped about a bunch of people. In fact, he was hated, and you've probably been there yourself in your life. He was hated because he was doing things the right way. Everybody turned on him because he was, and this is important to remember, he was the only God follower. He was the only Jew. He was living in a pagan, godless society, and here's this Jew, this God follower, this God worshiper, who's now about to be second in command, and the guys under him didn't like that at all. This is a man who was a faithfully devout God follower, who had found favor in God's eyes and been blessed by him in a godless society. Look at verse 3 again, if you've got your Bibles open. It says that he became distinguished above all the other guys, the other presidents, and because an excellent spirit was in him. God was blessing him. And so his enemies, they get together and they conspire to find fault in Daniel's life because they want to bring him down. And you can almost imagine in your mind's eye that everything he did and everything he said was looked at under the tightest microscope possible. And they're waiting for him to slip up. They're waiting on him to have some small moral failure that's going to disqualify him from leadership so they can say, "Ha, I knew it. I knew he was a hypocrite. I knew he was a failure. I knew he was a screw-up." And they try any and everything they can to find fault with him, but the Bible makes it very clear. At verse 4, it says, there was no fault in him because he was faithful. You see, the Bible calls that being blameless. Paul writes in the New Testament to Christians to be blameless in this fallen world. That word blameless, it does not mean necessarily perfect, but what that means is that you can, let's just use me as an example. I'm not saying I'm blameless in everything, but just for the sake of illustration. You can blame me, you can accuse me of whatever, but if I'm blameless, it can't stick. You can bring accusations against me, but it's not going to stick because I'm living my life blamelessly. For example, one area in my life that I'm trying to pursue blamelessness in is if you're female and you want to come talk to me about some issues, that's great, that's fine. But the secretary's going to be here or my wife's going to be here. Somebody's going to be here. I'm not going to talk to you alone. I made a commitment a long time ago when I was a youth minister not to take any girls around by myself. If I had to take a girl home after youth, it was either with my wife or with my pastor or somebody else. Why? Because if somebody came to me and said, "I heard you had an affair," how's that going to stick? No, I got witnesses. Well, we were laughing before, during the offering time, I had to run up real quick and make a copy of some stuff. And I ran into the ushers out in the hallway, and we were joking about when I first came here, like 2 weeks after I came here, somehow the offering basket wound up in my desk. That's not good when you're 2 weeks on the job. And so Misty and the guys that count on Mondays are like, we looked in the safe, we don't know where the offering is. And I'm like, well, that's crazy. About half the day later, I'm getting something out of my credenza, and I open it up, and there's a basket with money, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is not good. Like, my blood turns cold, and I'm like, somebody's setting me up. So in that moment, if you wanted to blame me for embezzlement, you probably had me. It wasn't my fault. But Daniel was a blameless man. See, Daniel, again, was the only God worshiper in leadership, and he knew that there were people watching him. You got people at work watching you. You got people at school, students watching you. They know you claim to be a Christian. And they're waiting. They're watching. But see, the cool thing is Daniel understood that it wasn't just his reputation at stake. He knew that it wasn't just his reputation as a man at stake. He knew that the reputation of God among lost people was at stake here. He knew that if I give them reason to accuse me and I give them reason to call me a hypocrite, then they have reason to call God false. And he knew that he was living for something bigger than himself. And I want to challenge you. We live in a day and age of the Christian celebrity, which is dangerous, right? Tim Tebow, all these people, and for some reason, we like in our culture as Christianity that if somebody famous gets saved, like we love that they're on our side now, you know, as if they're going to say something and like millions of people are going to get saved and revival is going to sweep America. No, that starts with us, ordinary people. Right? Jesus started with the grassroots movement with 12 losers. And I don't think he's going to change his game plan. But the problem is we see people that we don't necessarily agree with theologically or whatever, and they're on TV and they're all these, and then they have some moral failure. They have an affair. They embezzle money. And we go, yeah, I knew they were fake. But you know what? We shouldn't celebrate that. We shouldn't cheer that. Because you know what that's doing? That's bringing reproach to the name of God. Because that then turns from that person to Christianity, to God. And you know what? If you dug not very deep at all in some areas of my life, I would be just the same way. I've got some pretty accusation-worthy things in my life. And I'm pretty sure all of us do. See, Daniel knew that it wasn't just his reputation at stake. It was God's. In verse 5, Daniel's enemies say, we know that we're not going to find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with his God. You see, this blew my mind. Because Daniel's enemies knew that he was so faithfully obedient to God and he was so faithfully obedient to the king that the only way that they could find fault with him, the only way that they could bring him down is if they created some kind of scenario where his faithfulness to God and his faithfulness to the king would have to come to a crossroads, and he would have to choose God or the king. And they knew enough about Daniel that he would choose worship every time. And so they devise a plan. They devise a plan. Look at verse 6. Then these presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. They're sucking up, right? All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, we all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for the next 30 days, except to you, O king, they shall be cast into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. Basically, what they were doing is they had talked him into outlawing prayer. They knew that Daniel was a man of faithfulness to God. They knew that 3 times a day, at the same time every day, Daniel got on his knees before God in his house, not publicly, but in his house, just him and God, and he poured his heart out to God. And they knew we're either going to catch him as a hypocrite or as a lawbreaker. And they had him. They had him. Daniel knew the implications of the law, yet he remained obedient to God. Look at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. When the world stood firmly against Daniel, Daniel stood firmly on the faithfulness of God. When the world stood firmly against Daniel, Daniel stood firmly in his faith. He knew that God could save him. He knew of the stories of David. He knew that several years before God had rescued his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fiery furnace. He knew that God had brought his people out of Egypt through the waters of the Red Sea into the land of promise. He knew that this was the God who had done it before and he could do it again, but the problem was he wasn't sure if God would. He knew that God could and would remain immovable despite not knowing whether God would deliver. See, Daniel wasn't omniscient. He goes to his room in the face of death itself, with the law forbidding him to do his service to God. And he gets down on his knees just like he had done, just like God had commanded him to do. And he cries out. You see, there are times in our life where we have to come to that crossroads. As parents, as teenagers, as adults, whatever walk of life, if we're following Jesus, there's going to come a time in your life where your faithfulness to God and the world are going to come to a crossroads. And you're going to have to come to a point where you say, I know God can deliver me from this. I know God can, but will he? Because listen, there are plenty of examples in the Bible where God chose not to. I was reminded this week from an email, he chose not to do it with John the Baptist, didn't he? He could have saved Jesus. Jesus could have called down a legion of angels, but he chose not to. There are times where we have to come to that crossroads where we know that God could, but we're not sure whether he will. And the question then is, will I remain faithful? Will I remain obedient? Daniel got on his knees. You see, hundreds of years before Jesus even set foot on this earth, Daniel is showing us what it means to take up your cross and follow him. Daniel is showing us exactly what it means to take up your cross, embrace shame, embrace obscurity, embrace opposition, embrace rejection, embrace death itself. Take up your cross and follow him. We sang it a few minutes ago, and it's so easy to sing. I grew up singing that song. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided. But do we ever stop and wonder, what does that really look like in my own life? To really follow in the steps of Jesus. I read a book when I was in high school. If you're a reader, I would encourage you to read it. Actually, I was in junior high. It changed my life. It was called In His Steps by Charles M. Sheldon. It's where the fad WWJD came from. It was written in the 1800s. It's a phenomenal book. It really challenged me when I was in junior high. But Daniel goes to his knees. He goes to his house and he prays. You have to wonder, what did he pray? He knew that men were out to get him. He knew that it was just a matter of days before he would be brought to the king and said, yeah. I have to imagine, and I don't want to read too much into the Bible, but I have to imagine that Daniel may have prayed something that one of his forefathers had prayed. You see, Daniel, we saw at the very beginning of this series, Daniel is actually a descendant of King David. He's a descendant of King David. And so I can imagine he looked back on what his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had prayed. And I've got a few verses up here from the Psalms. Psalm chapter 56. I can just imagine Daniel praying this. Show mercy to me, O God, because people are crushing me, grinding me down like dirt underfoot all day long. No matter what I do, I can't get myself out from under them. My enemies are crushing me, yes, all day long. O highest of high, for many come proud and raise their hands against me. They conspire. Then they lurk about. They eye my every move, waiting to steal my very life because they are wicked through and through. Drag them out in your just anger, O God. Cast them down. I'm bound by your promise, O God. My life is an offering of thanksgiving to you. Can you imagine Daniel saying, I'm probably going to die here, but my life is an offering of thanksgiving. For you have saved my soul from the darkness of death. There's a few other verses we're not going to read right now, but if you want to jot them down, if you're taking notes, Psalm 69 and Psalm 83 are two that are very similar to that. But Daniel very well could have prayed that Psalm 56, crying out for God, help me and bring justice. Help me and bring justice. You skip down, if you get your Bible still open, to chapter 6 in Daniel. These men catch Daniel praying and they go to the king. And in verse 13, look what it says. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king. They're accusing him. He pays no attention to you or the injunction that you've signed, but makes his petition. He prays 3 times a day, regardless of what you said. It looks as if his enemies have had the last word. If you continue reading there, we're not going to take the time to read the next couple of verses, but Darius freaks out. He loves Daniel. He begins to stress out. He's greatly distressed. And he says, if you can just imagine putting yourself in Darius' shoes, he's the new king with a new kingdom, and he wants to find any way to get Daniel out of this situation. But if he does, if he bends the rules, he's going to lose face. Right? He's not going to be that tough emperor that he's tried to set himself up to be. And so he tries to figure out a way to deliver Daniel from this. And then in verse 16 through 18, we find out that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Look at verse 16. And then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And I want you to pay attention to this and see if any of this sounds familiar. Think whole biblical story here, and we'll come back to it. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled him. Daniel's thrown to this den of lions. He's sealed up, delivered over to death, dropped in the pit of the earth. And then look at verse 19. Then, at dawn, at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. In other words, Daniel's enemies were delivered into the pit, and they were crushed. Can you imagine what that night must have been like for Daniel? Can you imagine what a night with all of these lions surrounding him must have been like? What must have been really cool is the fact that an angel shows up and somehow shuts the mouths of these lions. And Daniel's like, "Please don't go anywhere, please don't go anywhere, please don't go anywhere." Right? If you leave, I'm dead. And God miraculously delivers Daniel from the death and delivers him into life and crushes his enemies. The accusers are crushed. Listen, as we look at this story, as we look at this narrative, your hope, my hope, is not in ourselves. Okay? Our hope is not in our good behavior. Right? We look at Daniel as being blameless. We look at Daniel as being a man of integrity and character. And we see in the end, God delivers him and his enemies are crushed. And in the end, Daniel was saved, we think, because he was a good person. And because he did something right and God delivered him. And it's not like you and I should look at Daniel and say something like, well, if I can just try real hard to be sinless and be a real good Christian every day, then every time life gets tough and I face the accusation and the opposition of the world, then God's going to bail me out. And he's going to do like he did with Daniel, as if it depends on my behavior. Right? That if I've got some sin in my life, but I'm being real good most of the time, and God looks at that and he goes, "Well, I'm not going to deliver you this time." We can't look at this story as if it depends on our behavior or our morality. Because listen, the truth is, you and I are going to screw up. We're going to sin. I would ask for a show of hands, but I don't want to this morning, as to who has sinned this morning. Me. I have. I'm not totally blameless. I'm not. It's almost an impossible task. Daniel was a man who found favor in God's eyes. And I want to clear something up this morning. You and I cannot and can never and have never and will never, we cannot by any circumstance earn God's favor. You can't. You don't reach a level of good behavior, of goodness and moral living where God goes, I think I like you now. I think I'm going to show you blessings and I'm going to show you favor. You and I cannot earn God's favor because our hope is in the greater Daniel. You see, Daniel is just a picture of someone who was coming. Our hope is in Jesus. Our hope is in the one who came to this earth and lived a sinless life, a blameless life, faced the accusation of his enemies, all the while sinless, was put to death, put in the ground with a stone covering it, just like Daniel, and then 3 days later was raised to the newness of life, and now we find out that his enemies have been crushed by death itself. That's where our hope is. Our hope is in Jesus. Our hope is in the fact that our favor, our blamelessness, our righteousness lies not in our behavior, but in Christ's. You see, because late last night I was reading the Word, and the truth of God just punched me right in the face. Because I looked at the life of Daniel and I go, I'm not blameless in everything. And you know what God reminded me of? The Father looked, oh, it was so beautiful in my living room last night. God the Father said, son, when I look at you, I don't see your wretchedness. I don't see your sin. What I see when I look at you is the righteousness and the blamelessness of my Son, Jesus. What I see when Satan comes to accuse you before me, look, you see Daniel, he's a pastor. I can't believe you let him do that because this is the sin in his life. This is the sin in his life. This is the sin in his life. And the Father looks at me, he says, yeah, but the righteousness of my Son covers him. Because when I was 12, I decided to follow Jesus. And the righteousness, the blamelessness of Christ is now transferred to my account. It reminded me last night, I was tore up. So I went to the New Testament, and it made me think about the woman who was caught in sin. I don't know if you remember the story or not, but there's a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. She was sleeping with men that weren't her husband. In fact, these men were probably married. She was a prostitute. And the religious leaders, the accusers, brought her before Jesus, threw her down to the ground, had rocks ready to stone her and execute her justly. I mean, it was the Old Testament commandment. And they said, you know what she's been doing, Jesus? Let's see what you're about to do. She's been sleeping with men that aren't her husband. You remember what Jesus did? Oh, man, I love it. He said, okay, so those of you who have never sinned, you get to throw the first stones. And rock by rock by rock began to drop and hit the ground. And do you hear what Jesus, do you remember what Jesus said? This is where it gets beautiful. They're all gone. And it's just her and Jesus. And you remember what Jesus looked at her and said? He said, woman, where are your accusers now? Go and sin no more. As a child of God, you have that promise. Daniel, where are your accusers now? Yeah, you're filthy. Yeah, you're a sinner. But go and sin no more. I've transferred the righteousness of my Son to your account. I know you're weak. My flesh is weak. I may be weak, but Jesus says, go. I'll give you salvation. I want to end with a story out of the Bible in Zechariah chapter 3. Zechariah is an Old Testament book, and yes, it does exist. It's one of those that we're like, that's in the Bible? Yeah, it's towards the end of the Old Testament. And Joshua, a high priest, is brought before God. He's caught up in this vision. Zechariah is. In verse 3, Joshua's the high priest now, like the pastor of Israel. Zechariah writes in chapter 3 of verse 1, then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament was the Son of God. It's a reference to the Son of God, basically Jesus before he came to earth. So this Joshua is standing before Jesus Christ. And Satan, the accuser, was standing at his right hand, ready to accuse him of sin. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord, who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. Sin, nastiness. And the angel, the Son of God, said to him, and those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to Joshua he says, "Behold, I have taken your sin away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments," or clothing. And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments. And the angel of the Lord was standing by, watching and approving. You see, you and I are filthy sinners. Let's just be honest. But if we are in Christ, Satan accuses us, and the Father says, "What have you got to say for yourself?" And the Son of God stands up and says, "I died for him. I cleaned him up. I cleaned her up. They've got my righteousness, Father." Can you imagine? Can you imagine what it would be like if we, us, as the people of God, purposed in our hearts, just like Daniel did in chapter 1, verse 8. If we purposed in our hearts to pursue holiness in every area of our life, realizing that there is a lost world watching, but always remembering that in Christ, our enemy, the accuser, has been defeated. Remembering that in Christ, we're not perfect, but we have been raised from the dead, looked at by Jesus and says, "Where are your accusers? Go and sin no more." Walk in the newness of life. See, that's what we command Luke to do. This is what we charge Luke Slice to do this morning. It's a picture of his death and his resurrection, raised from death into the newness of life. Maybe you're here this morning, and if you were to stand before God this morning, you would have filthy garments of religion, of sin, of playing a game, whatever it may be. Because there's never been a time in your life, just like Luke did, just like we had 4 kids do, just like I did, like many of you did, there's never been a time in your life where you said, "I want Jesus. Jesus, I want you to exchange my sin for your